So let's jump right into this. When we say Israel lobby, we're talking about more than just one group, right? It's not just AIPAC as many people think.
Exactly. The Israel lobby is, as Mearsheimer and Walt describe it, a broad coalition of individuals and organizations. While AIPAC is certainly prominent, there are others like Christian Zionist groups, smaller PACs, and think tanks, all working toward a common goal: preserving and strengthening U.S. support for Israel.
And that goal, from what I gather, isn't just political, it's economic, cultural, and diplomatic too, right?
Absolutely. The lobby's objective goes beyond fostering security for Israel. It also aims to promote a narrative where US and Israeli interests are seen as intertwined, leading to substantial material support, particularly military aid, and favorable policies, even when they might seem misaligned with broader American interests.
Okay, but let's rewind for a second. Historically, when this argument hit the public stage with that London Review of Books article in 2006, it caused one heck of a stir, didn't it?
It did. Mearsheimer and Walt's argument was controversial from the start because it challenged long-held taboos around questioning the extent of the lobby's influence. Some considered their work a much-needed critique, while others dismissed it as misguided, even accusing them of harboring anti-Semitic intent, a claim the authors have consistently denied.
And yet, as they argued, the influence isn't just an abstract concept, it has tangible effects. They pointed out the Iraq War, for instance, as a key area where the Israel lobby significantly shaped U.S. decisions. What do we know about how the public views this?
Interestingly, public opinion reflects a more nuanced perspective. In a national poll from October 2006, for example, 39% of respondents acknowledged that the work of the Israel lobby was a major factor in decisions like the Iraq War. Among elites, the agreement was even higher. This suggests that while Americans may sympathize with Israel overall, they are still critical of particular policies driven by U.S.-Israel relations.
So, it's not black and white. People recognize the lobby's influence, but they're also questioning it more openly. Honestly, I find that fascinating and kind of encouraging, but we're just scratching the surface here, aren't we?
We are. What you'll see is that this debate is tied to much broader questions about U.S. foreign policy, its priorities, and how aligned or misaligned those are with domestic interests. And that's where things really get complex.
Complex is an understatement, but that's what we're here for, right? It's intriguing, isn't it? How public opinion on the Israel lobby reveals both a recognition of its influence and a growing skepticism. Let's delve deeper into that complexity.
Absolutely. These discussions are important and honestly timely.
Exactly, and that's why we think it's so vital to keep the conversation going. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how the Israel lobby intersects with U.S. foreign policy, we'd love for you to support us. Consider subscribing to the podcast. Your support helps us bring nuanced, balanced dialogue to the forefront.
And it ensures that we continue highlighting these significant debates that shape our world.
Absolutely. Thanks in advance for being part of this journey with us. Building on that, let's take a closer look at some stark examples of how the Israel lobby's influence has been wielded. A key moment is the 2006 conflict in Lebanon. Shall we start there?
Certainly. That conflict is a textbook case of how the lobby translates its influence into tangible U.S. policy. Leading up to the war, Israel engaged in a well-documented military campaign, primarily aimed at Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. What's notable is the extent of U.S. support during the conflict, both diplomatically and militarily, despite a significant humanitarian toll.
And this wasn't just passive support, right? The U.S. wasn't on the sidelines.
Not at all. The Bush administration provided critical political cover by vetoing UN resolutions condemning Israel's actions and ensured weapons continued flowing to Israel during the operation. This wasn't just about aligning interests, It reflected the lobby's concerted efforts to fortify U.S. backing, regardless of the widespread civilian casualties and regional destabilization.
I've read the estimates: over 1,000 Lebanese civilians killed and massive infrastructure destroyed. How is this justified?
The justification often turned to strategic and moral grounds, portraying the conflict as a necessary confrontation against terrorism. But this framing was debated, especially since critics argued that it reinforced anti-American sentiment globally. The irony is that such unreserved support didn't necessarily strengthen Israel's security as intended. It often amplified regional tensions.
It's fascinating and troubling. And then there's Iraq. I mean, that's arguably one of the most significant foreign policy moves influenced by the Israel lobby, isn't it?
Absolutely. The lead-up to the Iraq War saw the lobby lending significant weight to neoconservative voices advocating regime change. While the official narrative centered on weapons of mass destruction and democracy promotion, Israel's interests in removing Saddam Hussein were closely tied to these U.S. actions, pushed vigorously by think tanks and lobbying groups aligned with Israel.
It seems like a pattern. But here's what puzzles me. Why isn't this criticism more openly discussed? Is it fear of backlash?
Precisely. Open criticism of the lobby is often stifled through conflations with anti-Semitism, intentional or not. This creates a chilling effect, complicating candid discussions about U.S. policy and its broader implications.
It's exhausting, isn't it? You can't have an honest critique when the conversation gets derailed like that.
Indeed, and it's a significant roadblock to productive dialogue. What's worth noting, though, is that conflating criticism of Israel's policies with bigotry harms not just the critics, but also constructive discussions about the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Right, and it feels like nuance is just stripped away. But doesn't an open and inclusive dialogue benefit everyone involved?
It does. But fostering that kind of dialogue requires overcoming a deeply entrenched dynamic. The fear of being labeled, combined with a history of valid concerns about anti-Semitism, makes this a delicate space. Yet, the voices calling for more balanced discourse are growing louder, thankfully.
And that's the heart of it. Challenging this polarization isn't about being against Israel. It's about aligning actions with broader American interests and values.
Exactly. For instance, surveys reveal that while Americans are generally sympathetic to Israel, many are critical of specific policies like the occupation or settlements. It's this disconnect that the lobby often seeks to bridge by narrowing the narrative space.
So the question is, who benefits from keeping dissent quiet and at what cost?
That's fundamental, because the cost isn't limited to foreign policy failure. Stifling debate erodes democratic principles, and that's the real danger here.
That's a sobering point, William. But if stifling debate erodes democratic principles, what does that mean for America's leadership in the world, especially with the lobby's influence on conflicts like Lebanon and Iraq?
You're absolutely right, Eleanor. At the heart of it, this debate about the Israel lobby extends well beyond specific events. It challenges the very nature of U.S. foreign policy decisions and whether they truly align with long-term American interests or are swayed by narrower, often short-term external pressures.
Take the Middle East, for example. U.S. involvement there has arguably been one of the most defining and divisive elements of foreign policy in modern history. But has it really made the region more stable?
Sadly, the evidence suggests otherwise. Look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It continues unraveling, with no resolution in sight. U.S. unconditional support for Israel, influenced heavily by the lobby, perpetuates policies like settlement expansions that undermine peace opportunities. Then there's Iran. Years of confrontational policy, often championed by the lobby, have pushed us farther from constructive dialogue and closer to escalation.
And let's not forget, interventions in the region like Iraq don't exactly scream success stories.
Exactly. Those interventions amplified instability. And in cases like Lebanon in 2006, US support doubled down on actions that deepened anti-American sentiment. These examples show how prioritizing the lobby's agenda often disregards broader consequences, as if the ripple effects don't matter.
Which brings us to the million-dollar question: what needs to change?
Mearsheimer and Walt argue for a recalibration. They suggest prioritizing American interests, meaning a tempered and balanced approach. For one, open discourse must be encouraged. Critiquing Israeli policies shouldn't be taboo. And just as crucially, US aid should be conditional, favoring actions that support peace and stability rather than entrenching conflict.
It sounds so simple when laid out like that. Why isn't that already happening?
Inertia, fear of backlash, and entrenched dynamics. The lobby has succeeded in making any divergence from the status quo politically risky. Leaders often take the path of least resistance, even if it's misaligned with broader interests. But history teaches us hard lessons, like Iraq or Lebanon, that need rethinking, and urgently so.
And isn't one of those lessons that having a single narrow focus can mean losing sight of the big picture? I mean, in trying to be a steadfast ally to Israel, are we actually undermining ourselves as global leaders?
That's a valid concern. Leadership isn't just about loyalty to allies, it's about upholding principles that inspire global trust. By appearing inflexible, we damage our credibility internationally, not to mention our ability to negotiate peace anywhere, be it in the Middle East or beyond.
And maybe more importantly, we're doing a disservice to democracy here at home, aren't we?
Absolutely. Suppressing debate or conflating policy criticism with prejudice doesn't strengthen democracy, it weakens it. An inclusive, open conversation about national interests, unclouded by fear, should be the goal. That's something we cannot afford to compromise.
So here's where we land. The path ahead is about balance and bravery, balancing competing interests while being brave enough to have critical, transparent conversations. Would you agree?
I certainly would. And brave conversations are the first step to reshaping policies that not only serve Israel or the US, but contribute to a stable and peaceful international order. That's what true leadership demands.
Well said, William. And for those listening, we hope this discussion has sparked some thoughts, maybe even stirred a little curiosity. If nothing else, remember, challenging the status quo isn't about being against something. It's about ensuring what we do stands for something greater. On that note, it's been a pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. Let's keep this dialogue alive. Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.